And that was not one of my stellar moments. So anyway, today we are studying in the book of Genesis. And today we're looking at a story that is, really difficult on a lot of levels. As we have found out in the book of Genesis, there are some difficult stories in it. There are sordid stories in it. There are stories that are just difficult for us to get our minds around. In my opinion, today's account of the history of Abraham fits the category of jarring and difficult to get our minds around. And it's in Genesis chapter 21, and I titled it what I titled it for a purpose, because we need to remember Isaac was not Abraham's first son to be sacrificed. Ishmael was. Abraham sacrifices his son. Not physically. Not like with Isaac, where he had to, God says, offer him as a sacrifice. But he had to sacrifice his son. He had to give him up. And that, I can't even begin to imagine. But he was in training for absolute obedience to God. And he, as the father of faith, was going to demonstrate that no matter what it cost him personally, he was going to obey the sure word of the Lord. So anyway, so we are in Genesis chapter 21 today. These are the projection is going to be the verses of Scripture that I have translated. I've got the credentials to do this, but it's always good, no matter what translation I project, to have your own version up in front of you, because there are nuances and differences to it. Nick, could you turn on that back television, please? It didn't get turned on this morning. Okay, so we are in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. As he had said, Yahweh attended to Sarah. He did for Sarah just as he had promised. So Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the appointed time which God had mentioned to him. Okay, so the very first thing I want to do is deal with the word Yahweh. We were supposed to have a song on the schedule today that was Praise Yah by Leonard. I think Leonard Jones wrote that one. And Praise Yah is just short for Yahweh. It's the same as Hallelujah. Okay, it just is the shortened form of this name of the Lord. And when Yahweh shows up, I will always translate it Yahweh. It's normally translated capital O, capital R, capital O, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D in our Bibles, because of the concern of the Jewish people not to mispronounce God's name. That's how they interpreted, don't misuse the name of the Lord your God. And that's not what it means. It means more about what people do when they use it as an epithet, or they use it to falsely vow or falsely swear. That's how you don't misuse the name of the Lord your God. Not vocalizing it correctly is a little bit of the outer thing that the Pharisees were famous for, rather than what was going on the inside. And so they chose never to pronounce the given name of God. And that is certainly something that, certainly something that I'm not going to follow, because of the fact that the Lord seems like he's really concerned that we know his name. And if you read Exodus, and you'll see he really emphasizes what his name means over and over, and wants us to understand what his name is. And when Jesus said, "Holy be your name," to the Jewish people in his day, he wasn't saying capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. He was saying, you know his name is Yahweh. And so that is something that we need to come to grips with. By the way, the middle thing is just if you took the Hebrew letters and made them into English letters. And then the last one, of course, is the Hebrew letters. So, okay. As he had said, Yahweh attended to Sarah. Some translations, he visited her. He was gracious to her. Other translations. What it means is he fulfilled his promise so that she was able to conceive and was able to bear a child in her old age. We hear throughout this entire story that it was Abraham's old age, but when you're a 90-year-old woman, having a baby is a pretty big deal. And nursing a baby. So, as we discussed last week, God obviously touched her body and rejuvenated it. That's why Abimelech was so interested. Okay, but anyway, so God attended to Sarah. He took care of her. He visited. He put his power on her, whatever it takes to make this thing happen. And so he fulfilled the promise that he'd given to Abraham, just as he had promised. So Sarah became pregnant. No, here's the promise, by the way. Then Yahweh said, I will certainly return to you at the time she will give birth. At that time, a son will be born to Sarah, your wife. Sarah was listening at the opening of the tent behind him and, of course, laughed. That was the first laugh. Well, Abraham's was laughter, too. He said, will a son really be born? He laughed. Now, Sarah laughed in unbelief, but there's a reason Isaac has the name Isaac. We'll talk about that today. But so God had promised that at a time, the normal birthing time, she was going to have a child. So, as he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son, and it was in his old age. Now, Abraham obviously had been touched by God, because he was able to have a sexual encounter with Sarah that she said clearly was over and done with in their lives. And it was so, when God touches you, you get touched. And so he was able to continue having children even after Sarah died, 37 years later. And then he took another wife and had more children. And it says, and we're going to get to that relatively quickly, that as he took all these children and he sent them away, gave them gifts and everything and provision. But by this time, he also had places to send them, because there were Lot's descendants, the Moabites and Ammonites who were becoming tribes. There were the Ishmaelites becoming tribes. So there was places that they could go as he was sending them out later on. This, not such the case with Ishmael. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of places they could go yet, but the Lord was going to help him with that. So in the number of years he was old, obviously physically God had done something to him. So Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore for him, Isaac. Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was an 8-day-old child, as God had commanded him. Abraham was a son of 100 years when Isaac, his son, was born to him. So God had commanded Abram, name him Isaac. Okay, so he did. This is Genesis 17. God said, Sarah, your wife, will bear a son to you. You shall call his name Isaac. So God gave him the name Isaac. That's what you're going to call him. And he said, this is the one with whom I'm going to have my covenant. It's going to come through Isaac, not through Ishmael, not through any of Keturah's kids. Of course, Abraham didn't know about Keturah's kids then. But he said it's only going to come through Isaac. And then he circumcised his son as an 8-day-old child. And that God had commanded that too. Now, the reason I'm pointing out, it says at the beginning of his walk with God, he says, walk before me and be blameless. Okay, now, as we look at Abraham's life, we notice blameless doesn't really work when you talk about the encounter with Pharaoh and Abimelech and all of that. He was a human being just like we are. However, if God gave him a command, he was blameless. If he knew that God had given him command, he wasn't going to ignore it. And God gave him hard commands. Okay? And so he did what he knew God had commanded him to do. That was him trying to walk before God and be blameless. Like everybody else, he certainly had to deal with other issues in his character or whatever, but he obeyed God when he knew what God's will was. And so he was told, a son of 8 days who is with you shall be circumcised, every male born throughout your generations, any who are born in your house or purchased with silver from every son of a foreigner who is not from your seed. So this is a command, and Abraham fulfilled it with Isaac. And probably his whole household. In fact, I know his whole household was doing that whenever someone was born in his household. How big was his household? Probably thousands by now. When it was time for him to go to war for Lot, he had 318 trained warriors in his household. And then that was before he was really, 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 wealthy in so many different ways. So he had a lot of people in his household, and God really helped him to be able to provide for them all. He was a great sheik, as we're going to see, as he again deals with Abimelech as they're working together. Remember, he's living in the area of Abimelech. We left him near Gerar last time, and now Sarah, they're still there. And again, when you think about what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah and the entire river valley of the Jordan or the Dead Sea, you understand why you don't want to just rush back. Even today, we're going to see when Hagar had a place, a decision about where to go, she did not go north, where it usually was a lot nicer. She stayed south, probably because of the destruction that it was, still recovering from. So, okay. Sarah said, God has produced laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. Then she said, who could say to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? But I have borne a son in his old age. So this is her victory dance. This is her march. This is her triumphal procession. She is so excited about the fact that after being married to Abraham, probably 70 years, 75 years. Remember, they married him off pretty early in their teen years. So she's been married to him for a long, long time and been barren the entire time, went through the humiliation of the Hagar thing. And she now, after 75 years, had a child for Abraham. And that disgrace, because in that culture it would be considered like, oh, God must not like you. That disgrace was lifted from her. It's the same thing that happened when you think about John the Baptist's mom. She was viewed in disgrace. She had, some reason God's not blessing you. It must be you. And then so later in life, she was vindicated also. So God has produced laughter for me. Isaac means he laughs. Okay, that's why he had the name Isaac. Abraham laughed not in disbelief, but in like, wow, this is bizarre. Why would God do this? I already got Ishmael. And he's laughing at the very idea, but not in unbelief. It's just that it tickled his funny bone, right? Sarah laughed in unbelief, and then this word's going to show up again in this account, but Isaac simply means he laughs. And Sarah points out, God has produced laughter for me. Who could have predicted this? Everyone's going to laugh when they hear about this. They're going to go, what? 90 years old and she's having babies? That's worth a laugh. That's worth a chuckle, because you're just, especially if you're some person going, I'm really glad that I'm past that time in my life, right? You walk away going, oh, my goodness, chuckling as you go. And so Sarah is saying, hey, who could have predicted this miracle? And that's true. Who could say that Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? And you understand the complete physiological change that had to take place in her body. Not only that she could conceive, but she could nurse children now. And nurse children, she didn't have a wet nurse. It's pretty clear. She was the one nursing. And a wet nurse is what happened with Moses. Certainly when Pharaoh's daughter drew Moses out of the water, she wasn't going to nurse him because of the fact that she had not just borne him. And so what happened was they were able to get Moses' mom to be the wet nurse, to be able to bring to him the nutrition that he needed through nursing. So anyway, who could have predicted this? I have borne a son in Abraham's old age. Again, he's up there in years. And it says specifically, because it's such a huge amount. Obviously, he's 100, but it says it specifically because it's such a big deal. Okay. The boy grew and stopped nursing, so Abraham made a great banquet on the day Isaac stopped nursing. Then Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing at Isaac. She said to Abraham, "Banish this concubine and her son, for the son of this concubine will not share an inheritance with my son, with Isaac." Whew. This is a hard section. So, we have a celebration, because that was a celebration. Remember, infant mortality was a thing, and so when they finally got through nursing and they were eating solid food, it was viewed as a wonderful celebratory moment, not just because it freed the mother from nursing anymore, but because of the fact that now it was assumed the child was going to live a long and healthy life. And so when the child got weaned or stopped nursing, that was worth a celebration. In that culture, it was about 3 years of age that a child would stop nursing, about the time they got around 3 years old. So don't think really super small child. You think, okay, about a 3-year-old. And that means that Ishmael was 14. He was 86 when he was born to Abraham. Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born, so now you had 3 years. And so he's a late teenager, 16, 17 years old. And it says Ishmael was laughing. Some translations will say he was mocking. Some translations will say he was persecuting. But the word is the same word, laugh. And so, as I'm thinking about how to translate it, you got to grab laugh, because that's the same word which is being used. Except his laughter, Paul in Galatians calls persecuting. So now we know, because that's under inspiration of the Holy Spirit in Galatians. There's a whole lot of ink spilt about how should you translate this. Because of the fact that we are also New Testament people, we can go into the New Testament sometimes and say, how did they understand it? How did they read it under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit as they wrote it down? And so for us, we know it is not like he was playing, because the word can be translated playing also. But it's not that he was playing with Isaac. He was laughing at Isaac and mocking him in some way. But it certainly was something that made Sarah very angry. And very angry Sarah was not something that you wanted to deal with. By the way, Hagar had already found that out. When Hagar got an attitude toward when Hagar got an attitude towards Sarah previously, after she conceived Abraham's baby, she started to get that haughty type of thing on her. And by the way, that was covered in Babylonian law. If the head wife, that's what Sarah would have been considered, gives her son or husband a concubine in order, and that would be a wife, okay, but a concubine, a lower status wife, if she gives a concubine to her husband to raise up children to her, because generally speaking, it would then be considered a child of the house, meaning under Sarah too. If that concubine gets an attitude and treats her mistress with disdain, she could be demoted again, unconcubined, unwifed. And that's what happened to Hagar. And that's a severe thing, okay? She was kicked back down to servant status. Shifka is the Hebrew word. That's what she was called before she was concubine. And afterwards, she was, she just got kicked right back down. She had no more social status. It's pretty apparent that she had some social status that she had gained back over the years by the time Ishmael was 17 years old. And that's because the name is different. When we hear about the first incident, she's the Shifka, which is the bondslave. Now we hear she's the Amah, which is the concubine. And she has grown in status over the 14 years. And you understand how this would work. This is Abraham's beloved son, and she's the mom of the beloved son, raising him and taking care of him as the mom. Her status among the household slaves is going to be elevated. It just is the way it is. And so she was known as Abraham's concubine, not in physical fact, because that relationship had ended when she was demoted. By the way, we know that for certain because Hagar didn't have any more children, okay, at least until she was kicked out of Abraham's camp. We don't know what happened later on to her. She still would have been a young woman by then. But we certainly know that here, her status, she was well thought of in the household. Everyone understood. This is, and it makes sense. This is the one who bore Ishmael to Abraham, a son that he loved. However, because Isaac was, as Paul said, persecuting somehow, and don't think about, beating him up or any of that stuff, but mocking, laughing at, that type of thing. Sarah's temper went. And she says, banish this concubine and her son so that they can't share the inheritance. Now, by the way, it was Babylonian law that the children of slaves who were born to the landholder were eligible for inheritance and should receive inheritance. That goes all the way back to the days of the Sumerians, which is, then the Babylonians came after that, and that was just incorporated in the law. So what Sarah is saying to Abraham is, I want you to break the law. And that is, there's ways around that, but she's saying, let's violate custom and let's do all that sort of stuff. And Sarah wanted Ishmael and Hagar out. So this is Genesis 16. The angel of Yahweh also said to Hagar, look, you are pregnant, you will bear a son, you will call his name Ishmael, for Yahweh has paid attention to your hardship. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He will settle near his brothers. This is the beginning of the fulfillment of that prophecy. Now, first of all, his hand will be against everyone. He was making fun of or laughing at Isaac for some reason. And that tells a little bit about his personality right there. Normally you wouldn't do something like this, but okay, a little rough around the edges. And everyone's hand will be against him. Sarah's hand was coming against him right now. This was starting him on his journey of separation because of what she wanted. Now we find out more about what's going on with Abraham in the next verses. And to put it mildly, Abraham is upset. This suggestion was extremely offensive from Abraham's perspective because it involved his son. But God spoke to Abraham, let the matter of the lad and your concubine not be offensive in your eyes. Listen to Sarah's voice, everything she has spoken to you, for your seed will be reckoned through Isaac. I will also make the son of the concubine into a nation because he's your seed. So, this was an evil and offensive suggestion to Abraham. And what that simply means is he wasn't doing it. Okay, he wasn't going to do it. When something is evil to you, and that's what the Hebrew word means. It was evil. It was repulsive is another way you could translate this. And you knew he wasn't going to do it, but God intervened because he just, you send them out and you're sentencing them to death and or being really taken advantage of. But when the Lord intervenes and says, no, I'm going to take care of it, he has the confidence to be able to follow through. Not only the confidence, he has the obedience because he's not given a choice. The Lord tells him, yeah, well, this is even though you love him, it wasn't my plan. Remember that. It wasn't my plan. Sarah and Abraham plotted together to bring forth Ishmael by Hagar. So even though he loved the son, God said what she's saying is correct. That's rough, okay? And so God intervenes, and he is making sure that, there's some promises attached. He needs Abraham to know that there's some promises, because that way Abraham will have the courage, it still would have been the most difficult thing you can imagine, right up until he had to sacrifice Isaac, or be called to do that. This was kind of his practice along the way, because he now has to send out and disinherit his beloved son. It's not even just the sending out, it's the disinheritance. Because God says, do everything that she said. So, if the father, this is Sumerian law, if the father granted freedom to a concubine slave, then that freedom also disinherited any children. And that's what Abraham is doing right here when he's about to send them out. This is going to be a legal separation which takes away any right of Ishmael for inheritance. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a leather skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder. He sent her and the boy away. She left and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water from the skin was finished, she abandoned the boy under one of the bushes. She left him and sat down a distance away from him, about a bow shot away, for she said, "Let me not witness the death of the boy." She sat across from him and raised her voice and wept. Well, that's nice. Okay, so Abraham obeys right away. He's willing to sacrifice his son in obedience, and he does it right away. It's like God instructs him during the night, and he gets up in the morning. And because you understand, if he had to dwell on this, he may have lost courage. He may have not been able to do it. Could have talked himself out of it, and he wanted to obey God. So he was willing to sacrifice his son in obedience. He sent Hagar away, and it was, the idea to send away, that also could mean divorced, okay? Separated, sent. And so it's pretty rough. She went to the wilderness of Beersheba, and that is, we need to remember the area. Abraham had been living up near Hebron. It's just in the northern part there, about mid-Dead Sea. Last week we learned he went down toward an area that was, he went down to Gerar, but it was between the wilderness of Shur and Kadesh Barnea. And you'll see on the map, those are the two lower things that I have encircled in red. And Gerar, I put north of that. Today archaeologists say that it's really southern Gaza. And yet I have a hard time saying it's between Kadesh and Shur by putting it that far north. Okay, it just seems. Beersheba, though, we do kind of have a pretty good solid idea of where that is. There's Beersheba, which is fairly close to the Dead Sea. But if they were in Gerar and it was anywhere in that area, north or south, just going east, he will live east of his brothers, right? In the presence of his brothers, just moving a little ways away, she starts wandering around. It's not real mountainous in that area either, so you can't imagine her going up and down the mountains and doing all that. She really probably did not wander that far. She just wandered. She had no idea where she was going, and you can imagine that the despair would have been building. By the way, Beersheba wasn't even named until the next chapter. It was a part of Abimelech's holdings yet, and it would be named after an interaction between Abraham and Abimelech. But Moses is writing this years later, and everyone knows where Beersheba is, and so the wilderness of Beersheba is around that area. It encompasses parts of the wilderness of Paran to the south, the wilderness of Zin, and an area that kind of overlaps all that as she is wandering around. So she gets near Beersheba, and she just gets away from him. She abandons him under a bush. And it doesn't mean she was rough on him or anything. She probably by then he was faint, and she just made sure he got under a bush, but then she left him behind. And she moved away because as he died, she did not want to see it. That's how much despair was filling her heart. And she basically just began weeping and crying out in despair. It's interesting because God had given Abraham promises that teaches you some things about how God works. Did God intend to protect and preserve them entirely? Yes, of course. She thinks they're going to die. That thing about by faith from first to last really does play in here, doesn't it? Because God his whole goal is to get us to be people who walk in faith. And when we walk up to a cliff or a wall and we can't see any way forward, and we cry out to him saying, Lord, your promises seem incompatible with what's in front of me, and then God removes the obstacle, it builds our faith. And so the next time we can walk forward far more confidently. They were in that building process, but it was not easy. I mean, and sometimes the things that we face are not easy, but they're all about building our faith. So she's crying out in despair. It says, then God heard the voice of the boy, not her voice, the voice of the boy. And an angel of God called to Hagar from the heavens and said to her, what is it that troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has listened to the voice of the boy over where he is. Get up, lift up the boy, and strengthen his hand, for I will establish him as a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She walked over and filled the water skin and gave the boy a drink. Okay, this is really interesting. God heard the boy. We hear Hagar raised up her voice. Not Sarah, she's back at camp. Hagar raised up her voice, crying in despair. An angel shows up from heaven and says, hey, what's the problem? You know, if you were having a conversation with that angel, you'd have a temptation to say, what do you mean, what's the problem? I said, I think it was Friday night. Was it Friday night we had the conversation? Yeah, Friday night I said, I don't think I've ever been angry. What did I say? Angry? Ticked off. Yeah, I said ticked off at God. I says, I really can't remember being ticked off at God. And Mark comes over by me and says, I think maybe you were once. And I said, really, when? He goes, when you were standing in your front yard and the Lord said, it's your fault that you and your family were suffering financially, and you looked up to heaven and went, what do you mean it's my fault? Yeah, I had that qualifies as being ticked off. Yes, it certainly does. So there's no doubt. So there's no doubt if I was Hagar, I'd say, what do you mean? What's wrong? My son's over there. He's about dead. I'm over here expecting to die too, and you're asking me what's wrong? We don't really get to hear whether she responded or not. Chances not. This is probably just the angel doing a rhetorical question, because Hagar would not have been able to answer civilly. So he says, do not be afraid, for God has heard the boy, which means the boy wasn't being silent. He was praying too. By the way, who was his dad again? Abraham, who had taught him 16 to 17 years about praying to the Lord, to Adonai, to El Shaddai. They didn't really view him yet as Yahweh. Usually when we hear about it, it's Moses having been introduced to Yahweh that reads it back into the text. But and they may have known his name, they just didn't address him that way. They didn't have an interchange. They didn't understand what it meant. But Abraham had taught, he had raised up this young man in his household to revere the same God he worshiped. And so you think he's over there dying of thirst, not praying? He's praying. And the angel tells us he's praying. And that God heard his prayers. God has listened to the voice of the boy over where he is. Get up, lift him up and strengthen his hands. So the angel is trying to give her insurance. The angel says, by the way, when it says strengthen his hand, now some translations that you have in front of you may say grasp him by the hand or take him by the hand. It's an idiom, and it means when you are, and it's pretty clear in the grammar, but it's saying strengthen him, comfort him, give him courage. That's what the idiom means. And so she goes over and I'm not saying she didn't lift him up from under the bush. I'm saying she, though, was to go over and say, this is how God has responded to your prayer. That would strengthen him greatly, of course, because he knew that God was watching out for him. So comfort and encourage him. And then all of a sudden there's this miraculous well. Now, it says, then God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. Was the well there previously and God just wasn't showing her yet? You know, I suspect that the angel needed to have this discussion with her. Most commentators, because of the way it's written, says the well was there. She just didn't see it. And God had to draw our attention to it. Can you imagine how embarrassing this would be? You're sitting there weeping and crying because God didn't make provision, and you were so caught up in your sorrow you didn't notice that the provision was sitting right over there. That'd be embarrassing. But he opened her eyes. He said, by the way, and I can imagine it was the angel, take a peek over there. And she was able to see clearly that there was a well. For whatever reason, she couldn't see previously. And so, but it was a miraculous well no matter what. It was there for her in the time of need. And so she was able to get the water that they desperately needed and be able to, survive when she thought they were going to die of thirst. I mean, she was wandering around, I don't know how long. The water skins that they gave them usually were goat skins. They could hold over 3 gallons of water. So, and they were used to using, they were people who lived outdoors with the sheik, and water was always an issue, so I'm sure they were not people who guzzled water needlessly. Okay, not like us, we have water, you just turn on the tap, oh, that's nice, we don't have to go out and haul it. And so they had, about 3 gallons between them. That's not going to last a huge amount of time, but it's going to last more than a day, okay, as they're wandering through the wilderness. God was with the boy, and he became great as he lived in the wilderness. He became a skillful hunter with a bow. He stayed in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother acquired a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Okay, that's pretty cool. God was with Ishmael. He was becoming great. Now, the idea of greatness can encompass a lot of different things. It can mean becoming strong, becoming wealthy, or becoming important. And I think it encompasses all of them. God had given him great promises and had said that he would be a great nation. And now he is becoming great as he lived in the wilderness. Then we're just given one example of how he became great. He became a skillful hunter with a bow. And that means that he could provide for him and his mom. Okay? So you got to assume that he had his bow with him. By the way, who taught him the bow? How to use a bow? Oh, well, that would have been Abraham. Or trainers in Abraham's household. What was it that Abraham had in his household? 318 trained warriors. Think Ishmael might have been under that training? Without even a doubt. And so he was quite capable with the bow, and now he became a skillful hunter. Because he's out in a wilderness, and how are you going to survive? Well, you're going to hunt. And you're going to make provision for you and your mom. And if you are a skillful hunter and you've got strong leadership skills, people are going to begin to come around you. And you're going to begin to build your nation. And that's really what was going on. He became a skillful hunter. He was in the wilderness of Paran. I already showed you where that is. That's on the south side, but it really goes all the way up to Beersheba and down. Some of these areas, they overlapped. Okay. And so she was in that particular area in the wilderness of Paran. And you saw how close it was to Egypt. It's in the Sinai Peninsula. So it's fairly close to Egypt. So the last sentence makes perfect sense when it says, and his mother acquired a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Abraham wasn't doing his job because he had divorced himself from them because it would have been his job to find her a wife. But because Hagar now was the one who was helping her son, she's the one that would do the negotiations for a wife. And it speaks again about financial success, because if you're about to go to an Egyptian family and say, hey, we're going to negotiate for your daughter, number one, you have to have the ability to pay the bridal price, but number two, the family's got to know you're not sentencing her to death to go out in the wilderness of Paran. They need to know that this is a good opportunity for her, because families always worked to advance their status. So by the time he was getting married, it was a status thing. It was acceptable to any family Hagar was talking to. And she went back to Egypt. When Abraham wanted to get a wife for Isaac, he went back to his relatives. Culture, same God, all of that, important. Hagar had come out of Egypt, and so she was bringing out someone from a culture that she understood. That would be the one where she'd be able to negotiate with best, because she understood the practices at least. So in the wilderness of Paran, he began his nation building with a wife from Egypt. Later on, we'll see the children born to him and the tribes and all that as we do another genealogy of Ishmael. But for now, we know that God's promises were coming true. Abraham sacrificed his son, and God fulfilled his promises to be the one that son needed. By the way, later on, we're going to find out that Ishmael and Isaac buried Abraham. So there was a relational connection that continued. Probably sometime later, because they had to get over the real anger about this. Can you imagine? You're Hagar and Ishmael. It's going to take a while, but eventually you're able to get through the anger of that. So, okay, that's as far as we are today. Lord, I thank you for this opportunity, and I ask that, to study your word. I ask that you would teach us what it means to walk in faith as we see Abraham. Lord, we know this was practice for what was coming with Isaac, and you also teach us and give us practices so that we will go through trials in our lives, so that we are equipped to get through whatever comes at us. Help us to be such obedient, blameless people in your eyes always. I pray in your name. Amen.